The Soviet Union, born from the Russian Empire's collapse, rose from the ashes of war and revolution. It championed the working class, promising a utopian future built on equality and collectivism. This message resonated globally, especially in developing nations seeking an alternative to Western imperialism. Rapid industrialization and military expansion solidified its image as a global powerhouse. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, led by Lenin, promised peace, land, and bread, but plunged Russia into civil war. Lenin's new economic policy aimed to revive the economy, but his death in 1924 led to Stalin's rise. Stalin's vision included rapid industrialization and forced collectivization, causing widespread famine and repression. The Great Purge saw millions arrested or executed, leaving a legacy of fear and suspicion. Stalin's ruthlessness decimated the Communist Party, military, and intelligentsia. The 1930s saw the rise of fascism, with Hitler's Germany targeting the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 was a temporary non-aggression agreement. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, catching the Soviet Union off guard. The initial weeks were catastrophic, with German forces making rapid advances. The Red Army struggled due to poor leadership and inadequate equipment. The Battle of Moscow, 1941 to 1942, marked a turning point, with Soviet forces resisting German advances. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, was pivotal, with Soviet defenders resisting fiercely. The German defeat at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi ambitions in the East. The Red Army began pushing the Germans back, eventually reaching Germany. The Eastern Front was characterized by unprecedented scale, ferocity, and brutality. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II as a global superpower. The wartime alliance with the Western Allies quickly unraveled, leading to the Cold War. The Cold War involved espionage, propaganda, proxy wars, and an arms race. The Soviet Union and the United States faced each other across a divided Europe. The threat of nuclear annihilation loomed over global politics. Post-World War II, an Iron Curtain divided Europe, marking the Cold War's start. The Soviet Union established communist regimes in Eastern Europe. NATO was formed in 1949 as a bulwark against Soviet expansionism. The Warsaw Pact, 1955, was the Soviet response, forming a communist military alliance. Early Cold War crises included the Berlin blockade and the Korean War. The Cold War was also a technological and ideological competition. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 shocked the United States, starting the space race. Yuri Gagarin's 1961 spaceflight was a Soviet triumph, but the U.S. moon landing in 1969 surpassed it. Proxy wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere resulted in millions of deaths. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, brought the world close to nuclear war. The Soviet economy stagnated in the 1970s, hampered by centralized planning and a bloated military-industrial complex. Dissidents began challenging the regime, calling for political reform and human rights. The costly intervention in Afghanistan, 1979, was a major strategic blunder. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was showing signs of strain. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the mid-1980s aimed to address these issues. The Gulag system was a testament to the Soviet regime's brutality. Millions were sent to forced labor camps, enduring inhumane conditions. The Gulag provided cheap labor for infrastructure projects and eliminated perceived enemies. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago exposed the system's horrors. The book shattered the myth of Soviet progress and revealed the regime's dark side. The Soviet Union harbored deep anti-Semitism, despite its official stance on equality. The Doctors' Plot, 1952, was a fabricated conspiracy targeting Jewish doctors. The campaign fueled anti-Semitic hysteria and purged Jews from positions of authority. Stalin's death in 1953 ended the plot, but anti-Semitism persisted. Jewish cultural and religious institutions were suppressed, and emigration was restricted. The Soviet Union, with its centralized control of information and its obsession with secrecy, had a long history of suppressing news of disasters and other events deemed embarrassing or detrimental to the image of the regime. From industrial accidents to environmental catastrophes, the Soviet government routinely downplayed or outright concealed information about events that could potentially undermine public confidence or invite international scrutiny. One of the most notorious examples of Soviet information control was the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, when an explosion and fire ripped through the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, sending a plume of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The Soviet government initially attempted to cover up the disaster, refusing to acknowledge the severity of the accident or its potential consequences. It was only after Swedish authorities detected unusually high levels of radiation in their country, thousands of miles away, that the Soviet Union reluctantly admitted that an accident had occurred. Even then, the full extent of the disaster was downplayed, and information about the long-term health effects of radiation exposure was suppressed. The Chernobyl disaster exposed the shortcomings of the Soviet system, particularly its lack of transparency and accountability. It also highlighted the human cost of the regime's obsession with secrecy, as thousands of people were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, and many suffered long-term health consequences as a result. The Soviet Union's record of suppressing information extended beyond disasters. The regime routinely censored news and cultural productions, controlling the flow of information to its citizens. Dissent was ruthlessly suppressed, and those who dared to challenge the official narrative were often silenced through imprisonment, exile, or worse. The Soviet state's control over information, while effective in maintaining its grip on power, came at a high cost, fostering a culture of secrecy, distrust, and fear. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union, once perceived as an unshakable monolith, was teetering on the brink of a profound transformation. Mikhail Gorbachev, who assumed leadership in 1985, inherited a system riddled with economic stagnation, social apathy, and a costly war in Afghanistan. Recognizing the urgent need for change, Gorbachev embarked on an ambitious reform agenda, introducing the concepts of perestroika, or restructuring, and glasnost, or openness, in a bid to revitalize the ailing Soviet system. Perestroika aimed to address the deep-seated economic woes that had plagued the Soviet Union for decades. Gorbachev sought to introduce elements of market economics into the centrally planned system, encouraging limited private enterprise and loosening the grip of state control over industries. The goal was to stimulate innovation, efficiency, and productivity, which had long been stifled by bureaucratic inertia and a lack of competition. Glasnost, on the other hand, represented a radical departure from the Soviet Union's long-held tradition of secrecy and censorship. Gorbachev believed that greater openness and transparency were essential for addressing the country's problems and fostering a more engaged and informed citizenry. He encouraged greater freedom of expression, allowing for open discussion of previously taboo subjects, such as Stalin's crimes and the shortcomings of the Soviet system. The impact of glasnost was immediate and profound. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens were able to openly express their opinions, criticize the government, and access information that had long been suppressed. A wave of long-suppressed grievances, from economic hardship to environmental degradation, surged to the surface, challenging the official narrative and demanding accountability. While Gorbachev's reforms were initially met with cautious optimism, they soon unleashed forces that would ultimately lead to the Soviet Union's demise. The relaxation of censorship and the encouragement of open debate, while intended to foster a more dynamic and engaged society, also exposed the deep-seated cracks within the Soviet edifice. Nationalist sentiments, long suppressed under the banner of Soviet unity, resurfaced with a vengeance, particularly in the republics on the periphery of the Soviet Empire. As the Soviet Union grappled with its internal challenges, events in Eastern Europe began to unfold with breathtaking speed. Inspired by Gorbachev's reforms, and emboldened by the weakening grip of Soviet control, popular movements demanding democracy and independence gained momentum across the region. In Poland, the Solidarity movement led by Lech Walesa challenged the communist government, ultimately forcing it to concede to free elections. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, a potent symbol of the Cold War divide, marked a pivotal moment in the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. One by one, communist regimes across the region crumbled, as citizens took to the streets demanding freedom and self-determination. The Soviet Union, already grappling with its own internal turmoil, watched helplessly as its satellite states broke free from its orbit. Faced with mounting economic problems, nationalist unrest, and the rapid disintegration of its Eastern European empire, the Soviet Union began to unravel. In August 1991, a group of hardline communists, alarmed by Gorbachev's reforms and fearing the loss of their power and privilege, staged a coup attempt, placing Gorbachev under house arrest and attempting to seize control of the government. The coup attempt backfired spectacularly. Inspired by Boris Yeltsin, Soviet citizens took to the streets in defiance. The coup collapsed within days, discredited and abandoned. It dealt a fatal blow to the already weakened central government. Yeltsin banned the Communist Party and seized its assets. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet flag was lowered. The collapse marked the end of an era for the world. The Cold War, which had cast a long shadow, finally ended. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism reached a conclusion. The legacy of the Soviet Union remains complex and contested. For some, it represents a failed experiment and a cautionary tale. For others, it evokes nostalgia for a time when Russia was a global superpower. The Soviet Union's collapse had profound implications for global politics. It led to the emergence of a new world order with the United States as the sole superpower. Former Soviet republics faced economic hardship, ethnic tensions, and political instability. The Soviet Union's disintegration sent shockwaves through the international system, leaving a void in global power dynamics. For the former Soviet republics, it marked a tumultuous transition, grappling with nation-building and economic upheaval. The legacy of a centralized, authoritarian past led to widespread economic hardship and social dislocation. The rise of oligarchic structures and the end of the Cold War rivalry left the United States as the sole superpower. However, new challenges emerged, from China's rise to global terrorism and weapons proliferation. The Soviet Union's collapse continues to shape the post-Cold War world. The Soviet Union's legacy remains a subject of intense debate and scrutiny, both within Russia and internationally. For many Russians, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a traumatic experience, marked by economic hardship, political instability, and a sense of national humiliation. The loss of superpower status, coupled with the perceived economic and social chaos of the 1990s, fueled a sense of resentment and nostalgia for the perceived order and stability of the Soviet era. Vladimir Putin, who rose to power in Russia in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse, has skillfully exploited this nostalgia, presenting himself as a strong leader capable of restoring Russia to its former glory. Putin's government has sought to rehabilitate aspects of the Soviet past, emphasizing its wartime sacrifices and achievements, while downplaying the crimes and repression of the Stalinist era. This selective memory has been reinforced through state-controlled media, educational curricula, and public commemorations. The Kremlin's efforts to reshape the narrative of the Soviet past have been met with resistance from historians, human rights activists, and others who seek to preserve the memory of the Soviet Union's victims and expose the full extent of its crimes. Memorial, a Russian historical and civil rights organization founded in the late 1980s to document the crimes of the Stalinist era, has played a pivotal role in this effort, collecting testimonies from survivors, publishing books and articles, and establishing museums and memorials dedicated to the victims of Soviet repression. The struggle over the memory of the Soviet Union reflects a broader debate about Russia's identity and its place in the world. For some, Russia's future lies in embracing democratic values, integrating into the global economy, and building strong partnerships with the West. For others, Russia's destiny is intertwined with its imperial past, and its revival as a great power requires a strong military, a centralized state, and a willingness to challenge the West on the world stage. The Soviet Union shaped the 20th century, challenging capitalism and supporting anti-colonial movements. Its legacy continues to influence global politics, economics, and culture. The Soviet Union's collapse marked the end of an era but not its influence. Its vision of social justice and equality inspired movements worldwide. The Soviet Union's legacy remains relevant in the ongoing quest for a just world.